Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to IsoBreak number 11. I'm Ravi Shankar, and this is a co-production of the New York Writers Workshop and the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. It's a reading series that's been happening since last March. We didn't think IsoBreak would be going quite so long, and yet we're still in various states of isolation. And so this has been a wonderful way to bring writing from around the world into our living rooms, no matter where we are. So I'm very excited that we have today 5 of India's finest writers. So it's a kind of an India showcase. And throughout we'll hear from each person, and then at the end, we'll have a question and answer. And so I hope that you can stay and join us for that. If you have any questions, this is, of course, streaming live on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. So there are many different ways in which you can access this reading. But by all means, send any questions, and our fine panelists would be glad to respond. So thank you all for being here. I'm glad to have with us Anand Thakore, Anil Menon, SUDEEP, Menka Shivdasani, Vinita Agrawal, and I'm Ravi Shankar. And so this is IsoBreak. And I will just say, in terms of our order, we're going to start with Vinita. And let me just... Okay, great. So our first reader today is Vinita Agrawal. And I'll move everyone else from the screen. Okay. And Vinita Agrawal is the author of 4 books of poetry, 2 Full Moons, published by Bambakala Books, Words Not Spoken, The Longest Pleasure, and The Silk of Hungers. She's an award-winning poet, editor, translator, and curator, and was the joint recipient of the Tagore Literary Prize and winner of the Gayatri Gamarsh Memorial Award for Literary Excellence. She's a poetry editor at the Usawa Literary Review, and her work has been widely anthologized. Most recently, she won a special mention in the Hawker Prize for Best South Asian Poetry, and she also contributes a monthly poem on Asian poets for the literary blog of the Hamlin University St. Paul campus. And most recently, she co-edited the Yearbook of Indian Poetry in English. I hope we'll hear more about some of these projects, and co-judged the Asian Cha Poetry Contest on the other side. She was recently featured in a documentary on 20 women poets from Asia, and she's read all around the world, including in Mexico at the Kalagoda Arts Festival in Mumbai. And she's curated literary events for Pen Mumbai as well. And you can find out more about her and her work at vinitawords.com. So what a great pleasure to have you, Vinita. Thank you so much for kicking us off today.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you very much, APWT and New York Writers Workshop, for organizing this, and thank you, Ravi, for coordinating this wonderful session. I'm very happy to be reading a few poems to all of you today. I hope to showcase some of the work that I've been doing in the last few months through this brief reading that I'll be doing today. The first poem that I'd like to read is For the Earth That's Losing Itself, after Dante Di Stefano. But before I read the poem itself, I'd just like to say 2 things about this poem. The first is that this poem was an epiphany of a poem that I read by Dante Di Stefano, who had written a poem on abused children and the trauma and the mental scars that they bear. And somehow the thought came to me that the earth itself is like a child who's been abused. And that was the starting point of the poem. But this poem also has a reference to a very, may I call it interesting, but it's kind of weird also, that in Maharashtra, in India, there are men who marry twice or thrice, and they're all water brides. They marry women to bring water back home, because the need for water is great, and there is so little water is scarce, and it's too much for one woman to take care of the entire need. So they marry twice or thrice so that there'll be more women to bring back water to the house. and the women don't mind it, So that was something that I found extremely touching, and that has a mention in this poem. Write about shrinking spaces. Write about the color green. Write a line of chopped trees. Write a symphony of broken rings. Write yourself an optimist. Write about grandma's earth, wells in whose waters you could meet your eyes, feather touch hand pumps that sprung fountains, the jugalbandi of rains and tumescent ponds. Write about making love. Write yourself nostalgic. Write about now, the unstitched bellies of lakes, white once the last skin of water disappears, summer crisscrossing powdery topsoil, imitating the open lips of earth, imitating the open lips of death on an old mother's face. Write yourself vetoed. Write about Madhav who marries thrice. Each bride a water bride, fetching more water. Write about women who welcome co-wives, who put lumbago before self-esteem. Write about the dictates of water. Write yourself polygamous. Write about Kalidasa's Meghdut, whether we'll ever know a messenger like it again. Dark, dense, moist, generous, giving, godlike. Write about lynching reservoirs dry. Write yourself parched. Write yourself anhydrous. I have always been thinking about trees, and ever since I was a little girl, I was always wondering about trees, the way they network and create forests, and all the magical things that trees do. And very recently, I had this thought that trees outlive men; they grow for almost 300 years, and even beyond that. And how would it be if we thought of trees as witnesses to our histories, to the history of mankind through the eyes of trees? So this poem is titled When the Zafar Mahal was being built in 1842. This Devdar would have been a sapling growing quietly towards corrosive times. The Himalayan fir would be soundlessly groping for the memory of stones. The Burma teak losing a battle in lending resolute patience to Buddhist monks. The mangroves of tidal plains cowering thinner against steel and concrete. The Kashmiri walnut acquiring ring by ring the dark lustre of Kashmir's frustration. Each tree a tower of silence, a mausoleum of words that should have been spoken. My third poem is titled Dashain. It stands for the festival of Dashera as celebrated in Kathmandu, Nepal. And Dashain in Nepal in particular commemorates the final victory of the goddess over Mahishasur, the embodiment of evil, who takes the form of a rampaging buffalo. I have rather strong views on animal sacrifice, and this poem is dedicated to that issue. Dashain, Kathmandu. By the time the cleaver has severed the buffalo's neck from its body, Court Park has almost 4 million witnesses to the slaughter. Only minutes ago, the man in the army uniform had indulged the animal, thumped its flanks, stroked its back, as though being minutes away from death, aren't we always? As though being minutes away from death allowed for a softening of sorts. After the slaughter, a river of buffalo blood floods Darbar Square. The head, neat and precise on the pavement, the body dragged to the butcher's. Amidst reverberating drum rolls, clanging cymbals, useful allies in a ritual. The slaying of demons has been reenacted, the earth rid of danger and mayhem. The innocent, slate-hued beast, a close cousin of the sacred cow, but not quite as venerated, sacrificed. Only the day before, it had pegged water hyacinths on its horns, while wading in a pond looking sweet and silly, unaware that it was really a scapegoat to appease a goddess on the 9th day of the Shen. The next poem that I'd like to read is titled Wallflower. This is a poem about suppressed pain, the kind of pain that we often, hide deep inside us and are unable to express it even through words. A heavy millstone grinding wheat to flour surfaces from childhood memory, my senses sandy. Odd that the oldest memories are by far the youngest. Strange that it is light that withers us to shadows. I've picked out your hands from underneath stones and brought them to my head to help me become myself. If I cry too little, strange fires consume my chest. How long will I blink back visions of things no longer in view? God knows in which hour of the night flowers fall. I can make flowers. Seeds and soil can make flowers. The flowers are always there. It's the monarchs that I miss. The last poem is titled Face Orogeny. And I wrote this because as poets, we're often in love with words, and somehow words kind of sometimes they overtake thoughts. And I found this bunch of words that apply to the different creases that appear on a person's face. There are specific words for that, and this poem got inspired by that. Face orogeny. From the small 11 between the eyebrows to the bunnies on the bridge of the nose, from crow's feet to nasolabial folds, lip lines to marionette lines, the face is a drawing book. Of all the 648 full moons I've seen so far, I recall the one that came a month after mother's passing. A gentle smile in the sky shining through July clouds, glinting in the rain. There's a mountain beside me made of moss of broken thoughts that I've culled from the grey mists of my mind. I didn't know the shade of mountains could be so soft. I've felt my heart plummet so many times that I fear it might need braces to stop from falling altogether. Something stays locked inside me, like a lift stuck between floors, like an image in an age-speckled photo that just won't clear, no matter how many lines I wear. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vinita. That was lovely.
Thank you.
And we will hear more from Vinita in a second. I'm Ravi Shankar. This is IsoBreak, the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and New York Writers Workshop co-production. And I'm very pleased that we have a kind of India showcase today, 5 of India's finest writers. And next up, we have my good friend and the multi-talented Anand Thakore. He grew up both in India and the United Kingdom and spent most of his life where he is today in Mumbai. He's published collections of poetry, including Waking in December, Elephant Bathing, Mughal Sequence, Selected Poems, and 7 Deaths and 4 Scrolls. I will say that Drunken Boat Books is going to be bringing out a collection of his selected poems in the US later this year. He's also a Hindustani classical vocalist by training, devoted much of his life to the study, performance, and composition of Hindustani vocal music. He's prone to break into song at any time, just a warning. He received musical instruction for many years from such luminaries as Ustad Islam Khan and Pandit Baban Haldankar. He's the founder of Harborline, a publishing collective, and Kishtish, an interactive forum for musicians. He has an MA in English Lit and has won grants from the Ministry of Human Resources and the Charles Wallace India Trust. And his fourth collection of verse, Seven Deaths and Four Scrolls, was recently shortlisted for the Jayadeva National Poetry Award. So it's a great privilege to have you among us. Anand, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, Ravi. Um, something about that first walk out into the city after months of lockdown made me think about the connection between architectural structures in this city and the architectonics of the sonnet. So I'm going to read two sonnets or sonnet like poems, if you prefer, that are about buildings. And, you know, considering when I consider all the evils of the colonial system, I can't help simultaneously feeling sometimes a sudden delight in my own colonial heritage, particularly when I look at a good old Victorian Gothic building. So this one is about Afghan Church, which is an old British building. It was built in 1848 to honor the British soldiers who gave up their lives in the Afghan War. Um, Afghanistan was a territory that was never successfully annexed to the British Empire. So I'm going to start with this poem called Nocturne at Afghan Church. Nocturne at Afghan Church. Raised in remembrance of a war that could never be won, poised in silence against the dark they stand, spire and lamplit arch conspiring to sing how the tongue I now speak took root in this land of mangoes, mangroves, lianas, and incessant heat. How sharp against the night their silence rings true, syllables of stone that praise a resplendent defeat, and the triumph of a language no tongue may subdue, whose defiant consonants and inscrutable cadence, victor and vanquished alike, shall never rein in, syllables of stone that grow in silence immense, and presage our return to that emptiness wherein our efforts at speech pristinely begin. Against the tongues we speak, we are not born to win. And I'm going to move from there to another sonnet, which is about a far more recent structure in the city. It's the sea link that joins Worli to Bandra. And it's something that stands outside the city, but it's still part of it, which is a lot like how I feel. Sea link, a swerve to the left, and at last I can see from outside the city I was raised in. At the edge of the village on my right, a finger of rock laid bare by an ebbing tide, the skyline retreating in darkness and halogen light. Surely the voice that once spoke true and lied, that said I belonged to this city of slums and towers, There's a side of me that wants to cast aside what links us together to commonly call it ours. And bound to it in concrete, this, our very own brand new sea link, remains inseverable from what I love and long to flee, though it claims to stand alone. Here none may linger, all must always move. It isn't true, but there's relief in pretending one is through, as taut white cables fly backwards above. And I'm going to conclude with a short poem which I wrote about 20 years ago. I thought of it because it's an attempt to, this sounds funny, but capture a sense of partial entrapment. I'm aware of the tautology there, capturing entrapment. But it's called Creepers on a Steel Door. Creepers on a steel door. 3 months now, creeping up this door, half open between myself and the garden yard. I wonder why at times it is so hard to reach the wide world across the narrow floor. Space must have its bounds, I suppose, though the heart's first impulse be to leap. The creeper does not wish to move. It simply grows. It is the eye that makes these broad leaves creep. But see how tight each tendril grips the grill, where the highest leaves, translucent shy, peep inside. I can tell what makes them want to hide. Could they hear, I would tell them, looking in can kill. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anand. That was terrific. Your audio is a little faint. I don't know if you can get a little louder. Great. Thank you all. I am Ravi Shankar. This is IsoBreak, Asia Pacific Writers and Translators in the New York Writers Workshop co-production. A couple of things I'll mention. The New York Writers Workshop, for anyone who's in the New York area, will be at the New York Poetry Festival a week from today. So if you're around, stop by and say hello. It's out on Governor's Island. And APWT's, the next IsoBreak will be dedicated to Meridian again. The first APWT publication has work from 37 different writers from over 14 different countries. So it's a very exciting anthology that you can find at AP Writers and a small press distribution in the US. Those of you that are interested in finding out more, you can check out New York Writers Workshop and the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators online. Very easy to become a member and be part of this great collective. So next up, I'm very excited to have actually a board member of Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. Menka Shivdasani is a Mumbai-based writer. She's published 4 collections of poetry. The most recent is Frazil, so a kind of selected poems from 1980 to 2017. She co-translated Freedom and Fissures and an anthology of Sindhi partition poetry. And we may hear a little translation today and talk about translation. She's also edited an anthology of women's writing brought out by Sparrow, and it was launched at the AP Writers in Singapore. And she's the editor of 2 anthologies of contemporary Indian English poetry, one for the American e-zine Big Bridge, and the editor of 2 bilingual books of poetry by the Sindhi writer Mohan Gehani. And her work has been widely published and anthologized. She received, congratulations, Menka, the inaugural W.E. Eunice D'Souza Award in 2020, Ethos Literary Award in 2019, and a Tagore Literary Prize certificate for excellent contribution to literature. And she's also been organizing poetry festivals since 2011 for the movement of 100,000 Poets for Change. And she, in the 1980s, co-founded the Poetry Circle in Mumbai. And as a journalist, she's worked on over 18 books, 3 of them which were launched by the Prime Minister. So it is a great honor and distinction to have Menka with us. I know she's getting over a bit of an illness, so hopefully your voice is fine. It's really wonderful to have you. Thank you, Menka.
Thank you so much, Ravi. It is a pleasure to be here. And yes, I'm just recovering from COVID, so it is not an experience that you want to have. Please mask up. Whatever they might tell you about not needing masks, please take care, everyone. So people who know my work usually associate it with the very feminist mindset and with violent imagery, but that's not the frame of mind I've been in lately. So I'm going to begin with a poem called Prayer. I do not believe in prayer, but sometimes the thumb twitches and the earth shifts slightly on its axis. A breeze from afar curves upwards. The wind begins to laugh. Thunder gurgles, swaddled in the moon, swinging softly between sundown and the stars. Lightning years away, a tree that lay submerged in a monsoon lake lifts its head to greet the sky. A bulbul builds its nest amidst the leaves. Between my shorelines, the river ripples, merges with the clouds, and something stirs that no one else can hear. You may know it by another name. And while I was lying in bed, I wrote a poem called Survivors. I do not usually share poems until I have lived with them for at least a couple of years, but here it is, 2 weeks after I've written it. I take this earth in the palms of my hand, feel the flutter of its wing, the warmth of touch. I must let it go, but there is still healing to be done. The slight tear in the feather, the broken spine. Perhaps it can stay a little longer. Birdsong between my fingers, cool breeze and warm skies upon the tongue. I feel its silent gusts upon my skin, seeking the oxygen that has gone elsewhere. And I know that there are black holes that bide their time in the distance. Earthbird, I will let you go to seek your kind and heal in the nest when I can do no more. But give me strength, as I hope to give you yours. Treat my hand like a bowl of grain and drink the nectar of my blood. I know your journeys lie elsewhere, but stay a while and let me taste the skies upon your tongue, just once before the ash arrives and settles in. There is another poem I wrote that had to do with what happened during the coronavirus outbreak. It's called Rivers, and it was a horrifying thing that happened. This is how it goes. The rivers do not speak. They have been silenced today, burying their secrets as bodies burn their banks. The rivers have nothing to say. These waters are soundless, but they fret and foam, swollen with bodies like boats colliding in the creeks with oars of broken bone. Silt blackened on the shoreline, ash on the tongue, eyes melting in the sand, arms turning into wood. These bodies will go unsung. In time, their voices will return, rippling through the air, rattling in the wind, echoes in the ether, here and not yet there. And the river will respond in gusts and fits and starts, coughing on the graves that lie below. Boulders break when no one sees. These waters shiver in the dark. Tonight, the dogs are happy. The vultures hover, peck, and bite. Such riches for them to feast on, each morsel a delight. Come quick, they tell each other, there are more bodies on the way. And the rivers, they have nothing to say. I'd like to move on to a poem called Sweeney Adrift. I'm hoping to work more with Sindhi folk tales as I go forward. And this is a poem that I wrote about maybe 8 months ago. It was published in the Bloomsbury Book of Great Indian Love Poems. And there is a Nepalese translation of this by Pooja Rai, which I'm hoping Ravi can share. So it's based on a folk tale which shows a woman braving a river every night to meet her lover. And she uses this earthen pot. And one day her sister-in-law decides to replace the pot with an unbaked clay pot, and she drowns. Sweeney Adrift. Sorry, I need this. What is this river that takes me along with the leaking pot against the setting sun? Shadows fall like lattice gates upon the face, and a song streams softly in the dark, whispers in the wind. I have crossed these waters many times before, but tonight the fireflies like false hopes in the sky turn dusk to darkness with every flash, and my lover seems so far away on the other side. Tonight the clay that these cold fingers cradle falls apart as though fire had never touched it. I, Sweeney, born in desert lands, I know the touch of sun and earth as it crumbles in my hand. The water black as death is seeping through. This broken pot bites my burning skin as crocodiles circle in the stone. Meher, I feel you like a folktale in my bones. But where are you as these whirling waves? But where are you in these whirling waves as my world disintegrates? And I will end with a poem called Kites. It goes like this. Kites are flimsy, fragile, decorative, paper thin, bearing their wooden cross, biding their time in airless drawers hidden away from the sky. Kites are nasty, like women. Sharp-edged they fly against the clouds, bite into your hand. The threads they bear have hidden shards of glass, unfurling as they gauge the weft of wind. You who stand on the parapet edge, believing you hold the strings, look up where it hovers and rustles. Kites are nasty. They soar, they tug against the reins, catch the nearest squall and disappear. You will only be left with a stinging hand and an empty space above. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Menka. That was really lovely. And I hope we can talk about the translations more. I wasn't able to share them, but I want to hear more about your Sindhi translations. So welcome, everyone. I'm Ravi Shankar. This is IsoBreak 11, kind of an India showcase. We're about halfway through. IsoBreak, again, is an Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and New York Writers Workshop co-production. You can, if you're interested in joining APWT, you can look at apwriters.com and becoming a member. And we have these kinds of events as well as publication opportunities in the community from around the world. So I'm very glad next to introduce my friend Anil Menon. His most recent work, Half of What I Say, was shortlisted for the 2016 Hindu Literary Award, and his debut novel, The Beast with 9 Billion Feet, was shortlisted for the 2009 Crossword Prize and the Carl Baxter Society's Parallax Award. Along with Vandana Singh, he co-edited Breaking the Bow, an international anthology of short fiction inspired by the Ramayana. And his short fiction has appeared in a variety of different anthologies and magazines, including Interzone, Jaggery Lit Review, and Strange Horizons. And his stories have also been included in several international best of collections. They're taught in universities and translated into more than a dozen languages. I want to talk to Anil about this, including Hebrew, Romanian, and Igbo, the Nigerian language. I really want to find out how you got your work translated into Igbo. In 2016, he co-founded the Dumphook Writers Workshop. It's a residential workshop held annually in Pondicherry, India. And later this year, and I hope we can find out more about this collection as well, a collection of his speculative short fiction called The Inconceivable Idea of the Sun. It will be published by Hachette later this year. So thank you so much for joining us, Anil. Welcome.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you for organizing this, inviting me. Thanks to AWTP as well as the New York Writers Association. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm afraid that I'm going to be reading a story. Listening to these poems, I'm once again amazed at how much can be said through so few words. Unfortunately, we storytellers are paid by the word, so we haven't learned the economy of expression. So I'm afraid I'm going to be a little verbose. And this story is, it came out of, I think, what every writer probably goes through if they have been writing stories for a while, which is a kind of crisis of words, what Germans call Sprachkrise. You feel that words can't do the job that you want them to do. This story came out of that experience, and it's called Aqua Biographica, and it's part of my collection, The Inconceivable Idea of the Sun. In a village not too far from the rising sun, there once lived a man blessed with the art of telling stories. Unlike many who find their gifts a burden, the man was as generous with his stories as a cow with her milk. All one had to do was ask. He was always willing to oblige. He even allowed his listeners to shout out words, random words, and he'd find a way to work them into the story. He wasn't too proud to include trees if his listeners wanted trees, or a great slow river with tangled blanks if they wanted a bit of water, or emerald green frogs plopping in and out of the river if they wanted a bit of mischief, or a pair of lovers entangled in the hollows of a peepal tree at the great river's edge, blissfully unaware of the emerald green frogs plopping in and out of the water if his listeners wanted life itself. Why, he'd even end the story in the old way. They are there, you are here. They are then, you are now. They have arrived, and you are home. He hadn't always been a storyteller, but when he was asked the story of his life, he would invariably begin from the time he had started to tell stories. So listeners got the full history, right from the time the goddess Saraswati had inscribed the first letter on his tongue, to his present state, deeply content with a beloved wife, a passel of jolly kids, and an extended family that grew every year in nephews and nieces. Perhaps he could have gone on in this manner, growing from one happiness to another. And no one, least of all the storyteller, would have been any wiser. But one day, his youngest child, or perhaps his eldest, it was hard to tell, they were also rosy cheeked and identically happy, asked him for a story. It was nothing out of the ordinary, and the storyteller had already included night and shadows, gracefully cast by a single lamp. And as if in agreement with his design, his youngest, or maybe his eldest, lay nestled with her head in a mother's ample lap, her large lambent eyes somber with sleep. The man cleared his throat and began. A housewife knew a story. She also knew a song. But she wouldn't tell anyone the story, nor did she ever sing the song. The end, sighed his youngest. He had expected there to be more to the story, but now that he had to work the end into the story, it struck him that the story was really quite complete as is. He let himself go silent. And indeed, the silence was as cheerful and heartwarming an ending as any. The quiet breathing of his youngest revealed the night had claimed her, as it had her siblings, excepting perhaps his eldest, who was in another city, working hard and working hard. The man gestured to his wife to put out the lamp. He expected her to protest, but when she complied with a smile, he wondered if he had stretched the story out even longer than had been necessary. Perhaps all he had needed to say was a housewife, and his audience would have filled out the rest of the tale for themselves with ambitious wives, selfish wives, faithless wives, forgetful wives, happy wives, fat wives, skinny wives, lesson teaching wives, or more likely, lesson learning wives. For that matter, why even include those two words, a housewife? What was so special about those two words? Surely his audience didn't need to be goaded with word prods as if they were ill trained elephants. Why not just tell the story entirely with silence? His wife spooned her body next to his, and he felt an overflowing of happiness, almost painful in its intensity at the perfection of his life. Now, it is a lot of some to be bound ever more intimately to life by happiness, whereas for others, happiness has the opposite effect. The man discovered, alas, that he was of the second type. As the days went by, he satisfied every request for a story with silence, though his natural generosity of spirit led to many breaches of discipline, such as a frown, a nod, or even quite unnecessarily, actually walking away so as to avoid messing this story with his presence. True, this new mode of storytelling demanded a lot more effort from his listeners. Silence is full of possibilities. The man used it only when necessary. But alas, it is very easy for the listener to hear what is not being said. One day, lost in silence, in the midst of a most complex tale, it involved a frightened queen, a thousand knives and thousand knights, and many nested levels, quite reminiscent of an ancient stepwell. He heard his wife say, "Don't disturb your father, he has no more stories." To use a bit of storytelling jargon, his wife's words threw the man completely out of the story, so to speak. He had been weighing many possibilities in his head, but this particular possibility had never crossed his mind. In one of those unexpected and not always welcome flashes of insight, the man realized the truth of his wife's words. Many stories say that denial is the first step to recovery in the face of irreversible loss. So it was with this man. That night, as his wife slept by his side, the man tossed and turned. His body burned with the fever of truth. The world rose and fell, keeping time with his rising and falling chest, as if each breath was attempting to build a factual castle from fictional air. He called out to his wife in terror, "Make it the way it was, beloved wife. Make everything the way it was." But in the silence, he heard only silence. It was true. It was all true, all too true. He had no more stories. Nothing would ever again be the same. No more stories. No, that was impossible. No, it was impossible. Why, at this very moment, his mind was weaving. His silence plagued mind didn't know how to proceed. What should he do next? When the man tried to collect the possibilities, they seemed to dissolve like the mist by the, yes, the river, the people tree, the emerald green frogs, and the lovers eternal. A walk by the river would clear his mind, rid the silence, make him whole again. He sat up, got dressed, and stepped out. He wasn't alone. A few of his dearest stories insisted on coming along. And though he pretended to argue, he was secretly quite glad. It was a moonless night, which is always inconvenient for a storyteller. A moonlit night can evoke many fine words and deep connections with other moonlit thoughts. Stories flow along almost effortlessly if there is a moonlit night to guide things. Perhaps if the man had walked out into a moonlit night, things would have turned out differently. He turned left at the intersection, which was a short distance from the old graveyard, not far from the bus stop that led to the city and all the other cities where his children worked, from the eldest to the youngest. A part of him wanted to turn back, but he consulted his stories, and they told him the river wasn't far, just a few hundred steps away at the most. Many stories say that the more one walks, the less certain one becomes of origins and destinations. So it was with this man. He walked and walked. He was headed for the river, but the more he walked, the less clear it became where he had come from and where he was headed. His stories wearied of all the walking. One said it would hitchhike, two waited for the rain to stop, three stopped for some chai, and to make a long story short, he eventually walked alone. He worked when there was work to be had and starved when there wasn't. Everything mattered and nothing mattered. But something about him still marked him as a storyteller. People would ask him about the weather, and somehow the weather would become more than the weather. Or he'd mention knowing a man walking towards water, and somehow it became more than about a man walking towards water. There was no avoiding it. Sooner or later, people would ask him for a story. Where he had once been silent, now he only loved. But even love, which was only unconditional love, was somehow seen to be other than love. He was asked the secret of happiness, of health, of wealth, of life's meaning, of immortality. He answered as honestly as he could, namely that as far as he knew, such questions have no answers. But when he frightened some in the crowd, he realized that they had been asking for the river, the peepal tree, the entangled banks, the emerald green frogs, and the lovers who would never die. This he could no longer give. Sometimes this made his listeners angry, and then he would have to resume his journey. But at each place he stopped, there were always a few who seemed ready to let go of their stories. As the man lay dying, he was pleasantly surprised to see one of his favorite stories approach with folded palms. He had believed all his stories had been left behind, and he realized he had been mistaken. His eye had been padding along silently beside him all this time. In these final moments, the self pleaded wordlessly for a story to hold back the darkness. The man embraced his self, his subtlest story, and reminded it that stories are forged as gates, not walls. Open. There is nothing to fear. Love is all there is. Invite love in. Let love in and live forever in love. Behold the tree, the peepal tree, the emerald green frogs plopping in and out of the water, the eternal lovers by the tangled bank. The man could see them now, his beloved wife and each and every one of his little monkeys. Oh, how he loved them, how he loved life. They were waiting for him, their arms aching to hugs, smiles as wide as the universe. He was here in the now. He had arrived. He was home. That's it, Ragi. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And will you let us know when is this book coming out with Hashat, Anil?
Yes, end of the year.
End of the year.
Yeah.
Great. The inconceivable idea of the sun. Really looking forward to it. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for being here. I'm Ravi Shankar. This is IsoBreak number 11, India Showcase. And we're on to our final reader of the evening. I hope you will stay because we'll have a bit of a Q&A and conversation after we're finished. It's been wonderful to start my morning. I know it's evening and afternoon for where some of you are, but to start my morning with this great, delectable bouquet of literature. So our final reader of the evening is SUDEEP Sen, prize-winning author of many books, including Postmarked India, New and Selected Poems, published by HarperCollins, Rain Arya, the name of his lovely son, that won the A.K. Ramanujan Translation Award, and then Fractals, New and Selected Poems, 1980 to 2015. He's also published Erotext and Contagion Consolation, and most recently, and I'm hoping that we will hear about this, Anthropocene Climate Change, which you have with you, right, SUDEEP? Yes. He's also influential anthologist. He edited books such as the HarperCollins Book of English Poetry, World English Poetry, and Modern English Poetry by Younger Indians. Sen's work has been translated into over 25 different languages, although we don't know if Igbo is one of them. We'll have to find out. His words have appeared in numerous publications, including the Times Literary Supplement, Newsweek, The Guardian, The Observer, The Harvard Review, broadcast on BBC, PBS, CNN, Doordarshan, and his newer work appears in Granta's New Writing, in Norton's Language for a New Century, in Blood Axe Books Out of Bounds, and Initiate, the Oxford Book of New Writing. He's the editorial director of Arak Arts, and also the founding editor of Atlas, and currently the inaugural artist in residence at the Museo Camera. And he's also the first Asian ever who was honored to deliver the Derek Walcott Lecture and read at the Nobel Laureate Festival. The government of India has awarded him the Senior Fellowship for Outstanding Persons in the Field of Culture and Literature. So great honor to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining, SUDEEP.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be among friends as always. And it's so nice to see all of you happy and healthy. I know many of us have gone through tragedies, so it's good to see a smile on everyone's face. I'll focus my reading completely of poems from the new book, which is available now on Amazon, Anthropocene, which deals with climate change, the pandemic, and of course, it's a book of hope, so consolation. The first poem is called Obituary, and let me show you this graphic. The early days of the pandemic, the New York Times twice had the front page like this. The one at the bottom just simply had a whole row of names with a headline of people who had died. And the other one is just a black page. It's just quite something. And so the poem starts with simply the headline from New York Times, Obituary. And I quote, "They were not simply names on a list. They were us. Death knells peal, numbers multiply. Virus ravages us one by one. Newspaper columns loom, unsteady, ghostly apparitions on broadsheets. Name, age, date of death. Tall epitaphs in fine print. Ink spills, bleeds dark. Newsprint blotting out our wheezing breath. No amount of hygiene ritual enables our lungs to resuscitate. Our lives, micro-point-size fonts on an ever-inflating pandemic list. Black specks, fugitive lonely numbers, the deceased on an official roster. Another sick, another dying, another dead. Yes, they were us." This one is called Disembodied, and the location, of course, is very much the city I live in, which is Delhi, and the way pollution affects people. And again, this was written early days of the pandemic, a few years ago. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. This searing ultraviolet light from Aurora Borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh, sculpted from fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak, my lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. Our universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worship, not for its blessing, but its contours, artificial shape shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal, and not by season's first rains, skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left, too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. The disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no pole star navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away, just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there is too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass. So this one is a poem called Preparing for a Perfect Death. So I don't want death to be very maudlin and sad. So if you're going to die, you might as well die with a smile on your face and with some preparation. It has an epigraph from Iftikhar Arif's poem, and I quote, "I want to be shattered like a dream, such a loneliness that wants to die." Get your papers in order, choose your inheritors fairly with love, care. Outline clearly who gets what they're required to execute. Execution after your execution, their inheritance, your legacy. Thereafter, the phase of reflection, call all you wish for one last time, forgive those who have wronged you, smile, hug, and give gratitude. Record everything in minute details, leave no unresolved business or debts. Donate your organs, give to the needy, veer on the side of being generous. Then the most difficult part, how and where to die and what to wear. Be tidy and smartly turned out. There's no room for shabbiness here. Of course, one would like it to be swift and painless, without any show. An elegant private ceremony for one, a dream end, a perfect death. Read two more poems, and this one is called Language. And it opens with, and I know many of us are translators as well, so it has a lot to do with translation and language itself and the politics of language. And it has a epigraph from Italo Calvino, and I quote, "Without translation, I would be limited to the borders of my own country. The translator is my most important ally. My typewriter is multilingual, its keys mysteriously calibrating my bipolar forked tongue. Black red silk ribbons, pools, unwind as the carriage moves right to left. In cursive hand, I write from left to right. My tongue was born promiscuous, speaking in many languages. My heart spoke another, my head yet another. The translation seamless. Oracles, ventricles pump blood. Corpuscle-like alphabets, phrases, syntax cross-fertilize my text, breathing life. Texture enriched, music, cadence spatially enhanced, osmotic, polyglottal, a polygamy of grammar. Letter forms dance, ligatures pirouette, ascenders, descenders, pitch perfect. Imagination isn't caged in speech. Speech cannot be caged in language. And I'll end with a very, very short poem that opens the book, and it's called That Is. And that is spelled I full stop, E full stop. And it's dedicated to my son, Arya. And when I sent the poem to him, he said, Baba, I have no idea what this poem is about. And I replied back, I said, I have no idea either. But he also said that there's something very captivating and mysterious and evanescent about it. And it's just meant to be that way. People seem to love it, but nobody seems to understand what it's about. And I'd like it to be that way. That is for Arya, my son. That is because we hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, SUDEEP. And will you tell us about Anthropocene and where we could get it?
Yeah, Anthropocene looks like this. And in India, you can get it off Amazon easily. It's distributed by Penguin Random House, so it's fairly easily. Well, once the bookshops open up properly, it should be in the bookshops as well, but it's now available on Amazon.
Yeah.
And in England and America, again, Amazon. Amazon.
Oh, look at that. Look at that big fat boy.
Dog Rishi, who's been at my feet just listening to the literature until this moment. Great. Thank you all. So we'll have a little bit of a Q&A now. Thank you all for a wonderful ISO break. And I thought maybe we could start with Menka, because we are, of course, the Asia Pacific writers and translators. And so translation is a very important component of the kind of work that we're invested in and the work that we do. So Menka, can you tell us about your translations of Sindhi? How did you come about it? What's the experience been like?
When was this? Okay, so this book was published in 1998 by Sahitya Akademi. And what we realized was that after partition, the Sindhi community had lost their land, and that resulted in losing the language and the culture, the whole ethos of, just trying to survive in this new world meant that they lost everything that was fundamental to them. And I worked with a poet called Anju Makhija and a Sindhi writer called Arjan Shad Nirchandani, who had lived through partition. And these were poems that were not available anywhere. He had his own personal collections. There were poets who told us that they did not write any poetry about partition because it was too traumatic for them to even think about. In fact, I wrote about this as being a sense of cultural amnesia for AP writers, an article on AP writers. And Shah pulled out these poems from his personal collections and said, what are you talking about? Of course, Vinita Agrawal has written a poem about partition. It's a beautiful poem about a deer, the deer looking for a stream. And we also looked at poems from Sindh, from Pakistan. This whole project took us about 4 years. No one was talking about partition those days. At least very few people, certainly no one we knew. Today it is a very big subject. Everyone's talking about Sindhi culture and everything and trying to bring it all back because we realize how much has been lost. And there's, beyond this, of course, there's a lot of other work going on, which is Sindhi writers are trying to reclaim what they have done in the past. They're trying to recover the language, trying to teach the language to new generations who have lost it. I certainly belong to a generation that did not learn the language because it was not part of our growing up. You know, we went to convent schools, we went to discotheques. Sindhi was not part of anything that mattered. But there is such a rich literature that needed to be retrieved. Shah Latif, Sachal. And there are people doing a marvelous work. I'll show you this book. This is Mukesh Tilokani, is the librarian and a poet at the Indian Institute of Symbology. I'm holding this wrong. This is calligraphy of Sachal. He's done a similar thing with Shah Latif. Now, these are books that do not get attention that they should, unfortunately. Indian Institute of Symbology is doing marvelous work. I've done a few interviews with these writers whom we've subsequently lost. There are video interviews available with them. There is another writer called Mohan Gihani, who is in his 80s. He's a Sindhi scholar. He was part of the Sindhiyat movement post-partition when Sindhi was not accepted in the constitution. He was fighting for that. And he's done a brilliant thing with translations. Normally we talk of translations as having a lot of problems. You lose a lot of things while translating from one culture to another, one language to another. Gihani translated his own poems. And then he came to me with those works and he said, can you edit them for me? So with one stroke, you're cutting out many of the problems that are associated with translation. So we've done 2 books like that. There was a book called Brittle Ice in 2015, and which is published by Copper Coin Publishing. And this has just come out, While Sowing Dreams. This is again his translations, which I have edited. It's bilingual, so I've edited the English version of it. And there's a lot of work going on in other languages as well, not just Sindhi. Exactly 7 years ago in 2014, July 17, 2014, this book was launched at the AP Writers Conference in Singapore. And it is a book by Sparrow, Sound and Picture Archives for Research on Women. The Tamil writer C.S. Lakshmi Ambai. She's the founding, she's the moving force behind it. And this is one of a series of what should be 5 books. Mine was the 4th book, the one that I edited. It has, if the whole thing will be done, it will have 87 women writers from 23 Indian languages.
Wonderful.
And these are women who have not been privileged writers like some of us are. These are women who've been tribal writers living in poverty, picking grass so they can be sold before, it can be sold before they go to school, so they have something to eat. These are women who've been, in fact, from middle-class homes, but they've been given sour milk because they are girls and not boys. These are women who fought for their freedom and who said freedom is not something you just expect people to give you, you take it. I think that was a very, very big takeaway. And unfortunately, the 5th book is not yet out because when good things happen, money is always a problem. So Sparrow has been struggling for funds, and I hope that the book does come out because it will be a very solid collection when it does, the 5 books together.
Yeah.
It just needs to
wonderful. And 22 different languages represented. I think that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Wow. And, translation is such an important underrated. Kind of in the U.S., it's quite an insular society, as we know. I think the statistic that's often quoted is less than 3% of the work published in the U.S. comes out of translation. And so bringing some of these writers into English, I think, is really crucial. And there's so many regional dialects in addition to the many languages that exist
Yes.
in India. So that's great work. I did notice, and one of the great things about these readings is you see these points of connection between different writers. And I noticed both SUDEEP and Vinita are heavily invested in climate change and in the environment and in what is kind of taking place. So, SUDEEP, do you want to talk a little bit about Anthropocene and what your motivations were to do this book at this particular moment in time?
So, climate change is something that I've been involved with for a long time. It wasn't a very sexy topic, say, 10 years ago. But, I've been part of a group which has been lobbying for rights and so on. As it turns out, because of the lockdown, see, I look at climate change as the larger umbrella of the situation that we are going through and will go through. Pandemic is only one offshoot of the larger problem of climate change, as are many others. And so, people talk about isolation and quarantine, and many of us actually work in isolation and quarantine as writers in any case, so it's not new. The only thing that is a bit of a problematic thing is we can't meet people and we can't travel, which can be a bit of a pain. But otherwise, mostly our serious lives is in isolation, whether it's music, for Anand, it's Riyaz, poetry is similar. But, about 20 years ago, I was watching a television documentary, and the president of Kiribati, which is a little island nation in the South Pacific, was on the air, and the journalist was asking something, newsworthy, like, what is your development plan in the country? And all he said was, the situation in my country, if you don't know, we are just 6 inches above the Pacific Ocean. We will be the first country to go underwater. Where are you going to take our people? You're talking about development, education, health. Will you take, this was, I think, a Western journalist talking to this man, a very, very erudite older man. So climate refugee. So it was such a mind-blowing kind of a thing that, you said, this is not carbon emission. This is not, we know about those things. But through no fault of their own, there'll be huge swathes of people who will be homeless, landless, countryless. And that got me deeply involved in it. Now, it just so happens that this book has come out at a time where, the pandemic has happened. It wasn't actually planned this way. It was something I was doing for a while. And in fact, the first wave finished and the book was ready. It was taken by the publisher. And I said, oh, well, okay, the timeliness of the book is gone. People are becoming well and everybody's out and about. And, the second wave is there. And now the first, So it wasn't necessarily written for this time, though I was involved with the larger issue. But as it turns out, the book has become very urgent and timely, and to the point that, many of the newspapers, like the Week editor called me up and said, we are going to send the book not to a lit person to get it reviewed, but we're going to get the science reporter to talk to you and get a scientist to review the book. The Norway Climate Change Federation similarly approached me to do an interview. So it's interesting that literature is actually transcending beyond the borders of the English lit and the poetry world and so on, which is something that I've always thought that it should do. I mean, I've never written poetry for the book critics and fellow poets. I mean, of course, those are my immediate friends and people who would read it more accessibly or not. But really, a good poem should go beyond your confines of your own writing. And when it comes to something as urgent as the pandemic and the climate change, it also becomes newsworthy. So let's hope, fingers crossed, let's hope it's useful, because there's a lot of facts which are there in the book too, all disguised as poetry or prose poems. But there's a lot in there. And there are several essays in the book as well. So it's a multi-genre book.
Wonderful. And Vinita, you've also tackled this issue in your anthology, Open Your Eyes, right? Which I love the imperative of
That's
that.
right.
Kind of open your eyes,
Yes.
wake up is how I kind of read it too. Well, you want to
Yeah.
tell us about your
Yeah.
own interest in climate change and putting that anthology together?
Yes, Ravi. Thank you for asking me that. Actually, I could have, thought of a more apocalyptic title than Open Your Eyes, but I decided to go with something as simple as that because the issue was so crucial and it was so horrifying that we didn't need to go into the apocalypse of it. We just needed to focus on the basic of what's happening. And it's horrifying to note that in the past 5 centuries, we've lost 900 species that existed on this planet. And it's all due to climate change. And I put this anthology together. And when I put it together, I realized that there are so many facets to climate change. There's this alternate sources of energy, deforestation, water scarcity, and what have you, animal extinction, of course. And that got me really that plunged me into this issue. And I wanted to bring out something that brought focus onto the whole broad spectrum of the climate change issue. And perhaps it was the first anthology that came out from India on that subject. And there were 63 contributors, and some of them were international writers as well. And SUDEEP and Menka both have poems in that anthology. And it's a subject very close to my heart. I feel very deeply about it. It's not like one of those happy, don't put pineapple on a pizza kind of a protest. It's way beyond that. It's very serious. And we're all affected. We're all in it together. That's the simple thing. And equally affected wherever we may live. And some of us are more responsible than the others for it happening. So we really need to open our eyes about that.
Yeah.
Talking about what Vinita brought up, in our lifetime, I'm assuming all of us are the same generation. I'm just assuming that here. I've only heard of partition and the trauma from parents and grandparents as being the big issue. We've not really seen something as apocalyptic. It was only when physical experience of bodies burning on the sides of the road, and my friends couldn't get a place, so they were being burnt in a parking lot and so on. It was just astonishing, So it was the very first time the whole thing was very visceral in a community kind of sense. Of course, worldwide too, So you can't not but respond, really, whether you like it or not.
There is a movement called eco-poetics that some of you are familiar with in the US that's taking place. And very much, as SUDEEP was saying, to transcend simply being a literary enterprise, but to be a pragmatic call to action in some way, to kind of raise our consciousness, but also to make us engage with these serious issues. Great. I look forward to both of those. And I would be remiss if we didn't ask Anil about these Igbo translations. I am so fascinated. How did you get your work to Nigeria? And tell us the story of that.
In the best way possible, with no effort at all. What happened was I'd written a short story for a children's publishing company, Pratham Books. And their specialty is, in fact, in translations. They translate stories into all the Indian regional languages. And it's kind of a heroic effort because their staff is not all that big. And this story was one of those stories that developed legs, So it began to travel a bit. So they are also looking for translators from other parts of the world. And the story is called Money Content Has Enough. And it's about a kid who is monitored by modern technology to the point of madness, So it's a graphic, kind of a graphic novel. The text was complementing the beautifully drawn illustrations. So it ended up with a Nigerian translator who decided to make the effort. Nothing from my side as such. I just so that's how it ended up as an Igbo version. Yeah.
And Anil, would you tell people a little bit about Dumphook, the workshop that you founded with Perveen?
Yes, that'd be a pleasure. So we started this workshop. It's a residential workshop, and it takes place in the Adishakti Theatre Complex in Pondicherry. It's a little about 50 minutes from Auroville. And we get about 13 to 14 writers from all over the country. And basically, all that we do is talk about stories. We have a special guest who is invited to give maybe hold a 2 or 3 day session, and it's been going strong. Our writers are publishing and so on. And what we wanted to do was, the 1 day workshop or the 2 day workshop is fine, but it doesn't have a transformative effect typically. And most people can't afford to take the time off for, I say, MFA in India. So we wanted a place where people could just forget their regular lives and just come here and just discuss fiction and poetry. And it's it's a high intense, high pressure. They have produced stories, and the stories are critiquing each other's work and so on. And it's been fun. We are holding it for the last 4 years. It's also very reasonable. In fact, the only cost that they have is to pay for their room and board. Other than that, it's nothing excessive over that. So it's affordable. It's a substantial period of time. And I am with Pervin, Saket, and Akshat, and it's been absolutely fun. Every year we have a lot of laughs, but except for the last 2 years because of the pandemic, that's put a halt to things. Yeah,
Wonderful. And
so
so
I'll be coming knocking on your guys' doors at some point, I'm sure.
yeah, so I'll put that into the chat for people who are interested. This is the Dumb Hooked workshop.
Yeah.
And I also want to hear from Anand. You talked a little bit about the architectonics of the sonnet and urban life. And I'm always struck when I read your work at the immaculate craftsmanship. You're someone who thinks about your syllables in a way that might not be so au courant today, but that I always have found highly impressive and that I respond to. So tell us a little bit about that. And I'm also quite curious. I mean, people might want to hear about your alternate life as a Hindustani musician and then also as a poet and a writer. So how do you manage these two, Anand?
I don't manage anything. I things happen. I was born to do the things I do, and I do them as best I can. And the more I've tried to manage it, the more I've collapsed, and the less I've tried to manage it, the better I've got. So it's am I audible, by the way? I think there were some problems in between.
You're still a little faint, I think. I don't know why,
Yes,
but
little faint.
Anyway, so it's like, whoa, where am I with? I said something recently when I was asked a similar question about my dubious disregard for mathematics in my early work. It's funny how lockdown has been making me feel more intensely mathematical about music and poetry. I feel this sudden need to contain everything within a sonnet-like form. For instance, it reflects what I'm going through with my personal space just now, the house I'm living in, which I can't move out of. But there are all these thoughts about the city outside. So when I finally walk out into the city after months of lockdown, I see a Victorian building and a recent construction through a different perspective. And that that sort of prompted me to write in the sonnet form again, although I'm not writing in 10 syllables a line and all that. Hey, I'm taking my liberties with it, and I feel strangely uneasy about that. There's one aspect of classical perfection is mathematics, pure mathematics, the kind you have in Carnatic music, for instance, or in some Hindustani music. But that is only one idea of the perfect line, right? The decasyllabic pentametric
mm.
pentameter. There's also so much else that can happen in form. Um, Confluence is very important to me. If poetry is about making music out of language and life, um, that life, and which involves everything around me and inside me, is one that has been pervaded by many different streams. there is definitely the English language there, which is what that first poem of mine is about, that the nocturne at Afghan Church. Afghan Church would have been one of the first places where the English language was spoken in Bombay, and a Victorian building. And so there is that sense of reliving the colonial heritage through the English language, but also realizing that we've moved way beyond that.
Yeah. I like that. I don't know if everyone could hear, but this notion of reliving the colonial heritage of the English language. And I when I was in an undergraduate, I studied with the American poet Gregory Orr, and I remember I was highly resistant to form at the time, and he made this very compelling argument. He's written about this quite a lot, but as a young boy, he had a hunting accident, and he ended up shooting and killing his younger brother. Which of course, very traumatic experience. And he wanted to write about this experience for years and years. And he found that he couldn't until he started working in form. And how he described it was providing a kind of scaffolding for these very difficult, nebulous emotions in some way. And that's a great paradox, of course, is that form can be generative. Rather than being a prison, it can actually create new vistas. And so even my students who work in free verse, I always encourage them to learn about and to be able to master form. I think it's very important indeed. I'm just looking at the clock now, and I know what a rich hour and a half of a reading that we have. I feel like we could continue going on, but I know people have other obligations. So as has become a little bit of a tradition, I would like to finish off this ISO break by going around and having everyone give us what we call the proverbial fortune cookie at the end of a great meal. So what would you like to leave us with? Is there something that you're reading, something you're working on, something that you're thinking, some kind of activism that you're engaged in that you want to alert us to? Why don't we hear from each of you? And again, I want to thank our audience for this wonderful ISO break. We'll have another one in August. So definitely check the transoms for that news. But Vinita, will you start?
Yes, thank you, Ravi. I would just like to talk briefly about the yearbook, which just finished co-editing with Sukrita. So it's the whole idea is to celebrate quality Indian poetry in English, published annually by Indians who live in India or abroad. And I invite everybody to buy a copy of the book because it's the one place that you can see the whole diversity of Indian poetry in English, Anglophone poetry, let's put it that way. And when Sukrita and I were working on the project, we felt that there's also a need to do a similar project on translations. There's this whole 28 different languages in India which are being translated into English, and somebody could perhaps put that together as a yearbook as well, which would be equally significant. So the yearbook that we brought out, being the editors, of course, we don't have our own poems in the book, which is a pinch. But I'm glad that at least we've been able to collect the whole body of whatever was published last year and put it together. But you see the whole spanning of that thing, the sourcing of the poems is a big challenge. So I invite everybody who's writing in English, who's an Indian, to submit generously so that we have a wider lens through which we look at Indian poetry in English for the next year.
Wonderful. And this is the Yearbook of Indian Poetry in English, and Hawakal is the publisher. Right? Wonderful.
It's the publisher. That's correct. Yes.
Anil?
Well, I would say that, in fact, this particular session, I think, is evidence of perhaps what I'm going to say is that I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the future, and I'm optimistic about this world. And I think it's not just because I come from a tradition of science fiction, but really because I believe that there is nothing that we cannot solve if we humans work together. And something like this, in which so many different people from across the world are listening, are contributing to this conversation, I think indicates that it's almost like a thirst in us to do it, to work together. So I would say that's what I would like to leave the audience with. That I think we can work together, and it would work out.
And I think we must also.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Anil. I love that. I think it's so easy to fall prey to cynicism. So to have a message of hope and optimism is really valued, I think. Anand,
Okay.
how about you? Where are you at? What do you want to leave us with?
Mine is a misfortune cookie. Because I'm going to quote the intense pessimism of a great Victorian poet. Well, I'm going to quote the line that got me writing sonnets again. I was working with free verse, and it's from Matthew Arnold. And of course, this is about overcoming isolation, and we are enjoying it. But Matthew Arnold talks about human beings as islands in his famous poem to Marguerite. The lines are, yes, in the sea of life peniled, with echoing straits between us thrown, dotting the shoreless watery wild, we mortal millions live alone. Okay, that was the line that got me writing in that style again. I'm trying to get that
Yeah.
sort of cadence in my poetry. And then when I walked out of the house after months of loneliness, or months of isolation, let me not call it loneliness, and saw this beautiful Victorian building, a certain perspective began to form. So I'm going to end with that very pessimistic line.
Yes, thank you. Misfortune cookie. I like it. And a little Matthew Arnold to boot. Wonderful. Menka?
Well, I grew up listening to the statement that nobody was interested in poetry. That was not my experience when we started the Poetry Circle in 1986. We found that people were writing, people from across the walks were writing, bankers and customs officials, and everybody was looking for a platform. Today, I find that many, many more people are writing. Today, many young people are writing, but they are in a hurry to publish, and they still don't buy poetry books, which I think is really sad. Everyone's writing poetry, but not enough people are buying poetry books. And my take on this has been that if everyone who writes poetry actually buys poetry books, there will be a huge, huge market for poetry that publishers will begin to recognize. And I think that is very important. And also, since I've been associated with AP Writers practically from the beginning, there was a meeting in Delhi that I had attended way back. And I'd just like to say that AP Writers has done marvelous work over the years, bringing writers from the region together. There was so little that we knew about Japanese writers, Vietnamese writers, Thai writers, and AP Writers has brought people together, which I think is a wonderful thing. And I'm just waiting for the conferences to be able to come back so we can meet face to face again.
Yes, absolutely. We were supposed to be in Bangalore this year, and it got pushed off. But it's been lovely to have Menka as a new board member, and so keep your eyes open. Hopefully next year when things open up, we'll have the conference again. But these virtual meetings are not quite as good as being in person, but still a nice lifeline, I think. So that was a wonderful reading, Menka. And finally, SUDEEP.
I would echo Anil. I mean, I'm positive and hopeful too. It's been a tumultuous 5 years, really. Last few years because of the pandemic, and 5 years of complete madness. And so, but the good learning and takeaway is that you can remove from the genuine from the ungenuine, the good from the bad, and you're left with the fewer less people who you can trust, which is actually a real great takeaway, because the rest of it is noise and fairly, you don't need it. You don't need it at all. So focus on the good, carry on working as we all are, which is why we are still smiling and we are together. And, like Menka and Anand, we go back, I met them both in 1990, and here we are, graying hair, older children, and still writing and smiling and holding our hands and, meeting each other whenever we are in each other's cities, sharing meals. So ultimately, it's beyond poetry as well. Friendship is very, very important. Trust is very, very important. And positivity is very important. As we all know, the currents which cut through Indian English poetry are very problematic, as is the case in many parts of the world. But, we've survived and we will survive because the truth and the untruth eventually come out. And what am I working on now? Again, a very old project. I've been obsessed with classical Indian dance and music for a long time. So my next book is in fact largely focused on Indian classical dance, called The Whispering Anklet. It's a very formal book. It's on Bharatanatyam, Odissi, Kalaripattu, Kathak, all sorts of dance. And also a section of it is on classical music, which Anand, we're very happy to send you a copy, because you're the only one here who will probably get the nuances of that. But that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Wonderful.
But basically, hold hands, smile, and just keep writing. Yes, that's all we can do.
Yeah. Great. Wonderful to have everyone here for this ISO break. I just put in the chat, many of you know my news is my memoir Correctional will be out in the fall, and I just did a little podcast interview for The Common. And I will leave you, I was just sent this by a friend, and the wonderful thing about poetry is that epigrammatic quality and how it can kind of capture the quintessence of any given moment. And so this is a little quote from Neruda I will leave us with. While nothing can save us from death, still love redeems each breath. Which I think is really quite lovely. And this feeling of love and camaraderie and friendship that has been, I echo all of that. So it's been wonderful to be with all of you. And thank you all for watching. These readings will be archived on YouTube, so you can always go back and have a look. And hope you are staying safe and inspired. And as has been said, keep working and keep smiling. So thank you all for being with us today. Until
Thank you,
next
Ravi.
time, I'm Ravi Shankar. This has been IsoBreak, Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and New York Writers Workshop joint production. See you all next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye. All the best.